Well, today I'm going to do a very short prophecy update called Barrage. I'm on vacation, so I'm recording this from the home where we're staying at. So I apologize for any extraneous noises. I know in my stepfather's den there's a beep that I've wondered where that beep has been coming from for years, so you might hear that. You might also hear my phone going off, and that's why I'm going to talk a little bit about today at the end of this barrage, because Israel is under attack again with a rocket barrage. Pretty extensive one, a pretty large one from Gaza into southern and central Israel. So let's just look a little bit at the convergence of events like we do each week. Also want you to know that I did do a teaching at Devore Church on Wednesday night, May 1st. You can find that on YouTube at Devore Truth is their YouTube channel, Devore Truth, D-E-V-O-R-E, Truth. It's a pretty long one. It was on Ezekiel chapter 23 and threw in a little bit of some current events as well. So let's look at these, some of the events that took place this week. The first thing I'm going to focus on is sort of these interesting things that we see in some of the newspapers. For example, this is a graphic that was used on the front page of the Financial Times about a week ago, talking about despots. And so people that stand for nationalism and that sort of thing now are called despots. In fact, this week I think you saw that Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter banned a bunch of conservative, what they call far-right conservatives, Alex Jones, Milo Yiannopoulos, Laura Loomer, a couple of others. Twitter banned James Woods, is my understanding. And so there's a lot of censorship going on. And you'll notice that this is what the left do, is they always accuse the people who oppose them of being what they really are. And again, I have my phone sitting here next to me, and it's constantly buzzing with these updates. This was a story that, and now I'm going to talk a little bit about persecution. This is a story that appeared in some of the Australian newspapers. A couple weeks ago, I mentioned Israel Folau, who is probably one of the best, if not the best, rugby players in the world. He had about a $4 million per year contract to play rugby in Australia. And he actually quoted scripture from Galatians about who does not inherit the kingdom of God. And because of that, it was considered to be hate speech. And the word is that they're going to terminate his contract. This week, another rugby player in Australia, Sammy Karavi, who is from the Fiji, had put up a quote. And the quote that he put up was, he actually put up on Easter Sunday, Resurrection Sunday, a quote from John 3:16. He actually posted the verse, and then at the end he said, "I love Jesus. I love you for dying for me." And because of that, now he has come out and apologized for what he said, because now there is this political correctness that's infecting the sports world. And it's interesting that probably one of the most physical of sports, rugby, is where everybody is playing by these rules where you can't say anything. So this is something that I think is going to increase. In Canada, I mentioned this a few weeks ago, there was a father and mother. They'd gone through a divorce. They had joint custody. And the 14-year-old son announced, mainly living with the mother, wanted to become a female. So they started the child on hormones. The father objected. It ended up in a court case, and the court in British Columbia said, essentially, you cannot intervene, father, in the care of your child. And if you do anything about it, we're going to consider it family violence. Well, the father continued to speak out. He didn't mention names or anything like that. But the Canadian or the British Columbia Supreme Court now has issued a gag order that prohibits him from talking anything about the case. Here's what the article from the Vancouver Sun said the other day. The Supreme Court judges ordered the father to stop publicly discussing the case after finding some of his interviews with conservative media outlets. Again, notice they have to say conservative media outlets. They would never say if he talked to, say, the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Independent or any other paper like that, that they were liberal left-wing media outlets. But they always make sure you identify conservative media outlets, because the implication is you really shouldn't believe anything that they're doing. After finding some of his interviews with conservative media outlets exposed his child to significant harm and constituted family violence. But the father's lawyers say the restraining order is draconian and they plan to appeal. Quote, "We'll make submissions on freedom of expression, freedom of thought and opinion, and freedom of conscience in this matter," said lawyer Herb Dunton. A publication ban restricts media from identifying the child or father by name. We're going to see this a lot. So here they are. They're taking this child. They are chemically castrating this child during puberty. First chemically castrating, then physically. I believe they've already physically castrated the child. And now they're proceeding with this, and the father's not allowed to say anything about it. In fact, there was a gag order posted on the internet the other day. I didn't have time to grab it, and I went back to try to get a copy of the British Supreme Court order. The British Supreme Court gag order is subject to the gag order, and you can't even go see the British Supreme Court gag order issuing a gag order. It's absolutely insane. Another thing that's important to talk about, and I think this is where all this leads, is persecution of Christians. The British Foreign Secretary issued an interim report this week. It's titled Bishop of Truro's Independent Review for the Foreign Secretary of FCO Support for Persecuted Christians Interim Report. Here's a picture of it that was issued. This is similar to some of the other reports that have been issued. This is a report from the UN General Assembly last year talking about persecution of religious minorities, but particularly Christians. And there's some interesting comments or statements in this British report that came out this week. And the reason they put out an interim report was they said that they started late last year. They figured it was going to take a year, but they decided to issue the interim report because the persecution of Christians that they see going on around the world was so severe that they felt that they could not wait to issue the final report. So listen to what this says. The final report will include a fuller principled justification for the work of the review. Significantly, it will argue that a focus on Christian persecution must not be to the detriment of other minorities, but rather helps and supports them. However, research consistently indicates that Christians are the most widely targeted religious community, and there are, throughout the report, there is footnote after footnote after footnote after almost every sentence documenting where they got this information from. The report continues, furthermore, the evidence suggests that acts of violence and other intimidation against Christians are becoming more widespread. The reporting period revealed an increase in the severity of anti-Christian persecution. In parts of the Middle East and Africa, the vast scale of the violence and its perpetrators' declared intent to eradicate the Christian community has led to several parliamentary declarations in recent years that the faith group has suffered genocides according to the definition adopted by the UN. Against this backdrop, academics, journalists, and religious leaders, both Christian and non-Christian, have stated that, as Cambridge University Press puts it, the global persecution of Christians is an urgent human rights issue that remains underreported. An op-ed piece in the Washington Times a couple of years ago, I think it was actually about 5 years ago, stated, persecution of Christians continues, but it rarely gets much attention in the Western media. Even many churches in the West turn a blind eye. Journalist John Allen wrote in The Spectator a couple of years ago, quote, "The global war on Christians remains the greatest story never told of the early 21st century. And the report continues. Evidence shows not only the geographic spread of anti-Christian persecution, but also its increasing severity. In some regions, the level and nature of persecution is arguably coming close to meeting the international definition of genocide. The main impact of such genocidal acts against Christians is exodus. In other words, we attack Christians and they get up and they move. Look at some of these statistics from this British report. Christianity now faces the possibility of being wiped out in parts of the Middle East where its roots go back furthest. In Palestine, Christian numbers are below 1.5%. In Syria, the Christian population has declined from 1.7 million in 2011 at the beginning of the Syrian civil war to below 450,000. Christianity is at risk of disappearing, representing a massive setback for plurality in the region. This is a major problem. The persecution of Christians is widespread. I read just another report this week of Boko Haram going into Nigeria, into a village, and going door to door and massacring 25 Christians in that village. This is happening all over the world. The Gatestone Institute this morning published an article about Iran's terror factory targeting Christians. In Iran, the summary of the article says, in Iran, any practice that contradicts Islam is regarded as a national security threat, punished severely by the court system. This comes from International Christian Concern publication in 2019. It also says this: revolutionary courts were created to guard against all threats to Islam. These courts have evolved into a well-oiled machine of oppression that operates with impunity under state protection. The courts are closely intertwined with the intelligence ministry. Judges have at their disposal revolutionary guards, secret police, and a network of prisons used to torture and interrogate Christians. Dr. Mike Hassani from Heart for Iran, Iranian Christian minister, reported in International Christian Concern, said this: if you recant and repent, you'll go to jail, and if you don't, you will be killed. Now, while this is true that there is persecution of Christians in Iran, there was also this report on Christian Broadcasting News Service the other day that Iran's intelligence minister admitted that Christianity was spreading in parts of his country. Listen to what the report says in a speech to Shia preachers in Qum, that's the Shia holy city. Intelligence Minister Mahmoud Alavi reported that Christianity is spreading in parts of Iran. These converts are ordinary people whose jobs are selling sandwiches or similar things, he said. We had no choice but to summon them to ask them why they were converting, said Alavi. Some of them said they were looking for a religion that gives them peace. We told them that Islam is the religion of brotherhood and peace. They responded by saying that all the time we see Muslim clerics and those who preach from the pulpit talk against each other. If Islam is the religion of cordiality, then before anything else, there must be cordiality and peace among the clerics themselves. The speech continued. It is not the job of the intelligence community to find the roots of these conversions from Islam, but it's happening right before our eyes, he explained. Also during his speech, Alavi tried to justify high levels of inflation under President Rouhani's government, but a group of seminary students listening to the speech objected. Dear students, the intelligence minister said, who want to proselytize, would you treat a person who does not share your opinions this way? Let me finish what I have to say, and then you can say what you want, Alavi replied. Seeing everything through the lens of politics is not scientific, scholarly, or intellectual, he added. So this is a problem. I also receive, and I do appreciate the emails that I receive from people around the world. There's some communications between my wife and a Facebook friend in England who works in the education system. And there was a case where a student was actually called down, a Christian student that she knew was called down to the office and asked specific questions to get him to issue an opinion on LGBTQ issues. My wife's friend is convinced that this is being done to target the student. I was reading an article, front page of the Intelligence, the Independent today in the United Kingdom, talking about how teachers are afraid that they're going to be subject to violence. Now, the reason that they're receiving threats and complaints and that sort of thing, and they're being attacked on social media, is because how they're shoving this liberal, left-wing LGBTQ agenda onto the children of parents, and the parents have no say in it. People who've complained about this, and this includes Christians and Muslims who've complained about what is being done to their children, have been banned from school board meetings or town meetings. So this is a real thing. I think it's going to increase, and it's just something that I think you should all be aware of. It's always interesting, though, how the media reports these things. For example, here is a report. This is from the front page of the Los Angeles Times here in Southern California. Reseda man held in terror plot. Look at what the headline says. Suspect spent weeks planning attacks in Southern California before the FBI thwarted him, authorities say. Now, this man was identified variously as an ex-soldier, someone who wanted to exact revenge for the mosque shooting, the mosque terror attack that happened in Christchurch, New Zealand. You have to dig through many layers of the report to find out that this person actually was a convert to Islam. And that was barely mentioned in any of the things. So just keep in mind, we'll see this as these things go on, as time goes on, as we get closer to the end. There will be increasing persecution of Christians. It's going to affect Christians in the West. But like the story that I received today, where Christians are being persecuted, the church is experiencing revival. So maybe this is what the Western church needs, and we shouldn't fear it. We should welcome the opportunity to suffer for the Lord. I guess that's the best way to say it. Go read 1st and 2nd Peter and what he has to say, what Peter has to say about persecution. I think it would be very encouraging for you. Just a couple things on geopolitics. This was a report. This came from, now there was a city until recently, until just a few weeks ago, in Kazakhstan, which was called Astana. Astana was the newly created capital it was created by the leader of Kazakhstan a number of years ago. Maybe I think 10 or 20 years ago. And what they've done is they've built the city full of modern architecture. It has a lot of sort of Masonic overtones, and Kazakhstan is an Islamic country. The leader, Nursultan, had retired a few weeks ago, and in honor of him, Astana, which had replaced a city called Alami, I'm not sure how you say it, had replaced Alami as the capital of Kazakhstan when they built this city. They've renamed the city in honor of the retiring leader who had been serving for 40 years. A dictator, if you will. Now, the reason I bring up Astana, or the new city now called Nur-Sultan, there was a meeting that took place, international meeting on Syria. This happened a little over a week ago. It involved the foreign ministers of Russia, Iran, and Turkey, and they met to figure out what are we going to do with Syria. Now, one of the things that came out of that meeting was that they issued a report, or they issued a statement, that Turkey, Iran, Russia all slammed the Golan annexation. What the President Trump said, recognizing that Israel really should be in charge of the Golan Heights. So they felt that this was important enough that they took their time at this meeting on what to do with Syria, which is still a mess and continues to be a mess and probably will be a mess for most of our lifetimes. They felt that they needed to say something about what President Trump had done with regard to essentially saying that Israel was the proper had sovereignty over the Golan Heights. Now, this week was Holocaust Remembrance, the day that Israel remembers the Holocaust. This led to a number of speeches from Israeli representatives. I'm going to play clips of two of them, one a longer one from Danny Danon, the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, who laid out for the Security Council Israel's right to the land. And then I'm going to play a clip of Ambassador Ron Dermer at the Holocaust Remembrance celebration held at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. the other day. So first, here's Ambassador Danon speaking to the UN Security Council.
When we last gathered in this chamber, the President of the Council, the Ambassador of Germany, asked me to explain how Israel implements international law, specifically with regard to the Jewish communities of Judea and Samaria. Today, I will provide the answers. But before we discuss international law, we must understand the context and facts. Today, I will present to you the 4 pillars that prove the case for Jewish ownership of the land of Israel. The first pillar is the Bible. The Jewish people's rightful ownership of Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, is well documented throughout the Old Testament and beyond. The second pillar is history. The Jewish claim to the land of Israel is confirmed time and again, not just with Jewish history, but with the history of the world. The third pillar is a legal claim. Our rights to the land are codified in international law, including in the documents that founded this very body. And the fourth pillar is the pursuit of international peace and security. A stronger and safer Israel means a stronger and safer world. It is through these 4 pillars, Mr. President, that I will provide you with the answers to your questions. Let us discuss our first pillar of proof, the Bible. The Jewish people's right to the land of Israel is mentioned over a dozen times in the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, which includes the Torah, the Old Testament, the prophets, and the writings. In the book of Genesis, the very first book of the Old Testament, God says to Abraham, and I will read that in Hebrew, "This is a deed to our land." From the book of Genesis to the Jewish exodus from Egypt, to receiving the Torah on Mount Sinai, and to the realization of God's covenant in the Holy Land of Israel, the Bible paints a consistent picture. The entire history of our people and our connection to Eretz Israel begins right here. It is not just the Hebrew Bible or the 15 million Jews worldwide that accepts this right. It is accepted across all 3 monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The Quran itself accepts the divine deed of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. Mr. President, the second pillar is the history of the land of Israel and the Jewish people over the past 2 millennia. The Jewish kingdom in Eretz Israel comprised 12 tribes. The largest of those tribes, the tribe of Judah, lived in the area now known as Judea. You all know the words Jew and Jewish. Jew and Jewish come from Judea. This was the kingdom over which King David and King Solomon ruled. It was a kingdom with Jerusalem as its capital. It was home to the first temple, destroyed by the Babylonians in the year 5087 BCE, and the second temple destroyed by the Romans in the year 70 CE. When the Romans destroyed the Jewish kingdom, they sent our people into the 2,000-year exile that kept most of us, not all of us, from our land. Even the Romans themselves admitted the land was ours. Those of you who visited Rome may recall that Emperor Titus famously commemorated his victory and the Jewish explosion by building an enormous arch on the Via Sacra in Rome. If you look in the arch, it includes an illustration of his men carrying away the menorah from the Jewish temple. But even though the Romans knew that the land was ours and we belonged in it, they attempted to erase our age-old connection to the land by renaming it Syria Palestina. Although most of our community was forced into exile by the Roman Empire, we knew that someday we would return to our ancient homeland. For 2 millennia, Jews across the world continue to pray 3 times every day for our long-awaited return home to Zion, to Jerusalem. As we just said on Passover last week, as we do every year, next year in Jerusalem.
And you can find that at the UN Multimedia website. You can find his whole speech. This is about a little over half of what he had to say before the Security Council on April 29th. On Holocaust Remembrance Day, they had a ceremony at the Holocaust Memorial in Washington, D.C., and this is Ambassador Ron Dermer. Now, I apologize for the quality of this audio. I tried to clean it up as much as I could, but the original recording was not that good. Here is Ambassador Dermer speaking the other day in Washington.
In recent years, we have also seen anti-Semitism increasingly poison minds in the political classes of what once proudly called itself the West. It has already poisoned a great party in Great Britain, and its noxious fumes have even penetrated this marble dome sanctuary of democracy. The Jew hatred of growing parts of the intellectual class is even worse. We have seen how the climate at universities has become more and more toxic for Jewish students, and how blatant discrimination against the world's only Jewish state has put a new face on the world's oldest hatred. We have also seen one of the world's most prestigious newspapers become a cesspool of hostility toward Israel that goes well beyond any legitimate criticism of a fellow imperfect democracy. The same New York Times that a century ago mostly hid from their readers the Holocaust of the Jewish people has today made its pages a safe space for those who hate the Jewish state. Through biased coverage, slanderous columns, and anti-Semitic cartoons, its editors shamefully choose, week after week, to cast the Jewish state as a force for evil.
He's referring, of course, to this cartoon that appeared in the international edition of the New York Times. I mentioned it a little bit last Sunday. The blind Donald Trump being led by the Jewish dog, which interestingly is in the form of a dachshund with the Star of David on it, being led around by Benjamin Netanyahu. That editorial cartoon was removed by the New York Times from its websites. My understanding is that the editor involved has been suspended or disciplined in some fashion, but it took a couple of days for the New York Times to actually issue an apology for what they had done. And of course, then there were all these people that came out, Bret Stephens, Michelle Goldberg, Thomas Friedman, who are all Jewish, who work for the New York Times. Bret Stephens came out and said, well, I used to write for the Wall Street Journal, started writing for the Times about 2 years ago. I don't see any anti-Semitism around here. Michelle Goldberg was also said the same thing, even though she has published an article recently about some of the border riots that took place that clearly had anti-Semitic overtones. Now, the New York Times International Edition published this as an editorial cartoon just a couple of days later. This is Prime Minister Netanyahu. I'm not sure this one is as anti-Semitic as the other one, but it just shows that even in the face of all the criticism they were getting, they weren't being very careful. I thought the most interesting response, graphic response to what the New York Times did was this particular editorial cartoon that appeared in some of the Jewish newspapers. Now they turned the dog in, changed it from Star of David to BDS. The head of the dog is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a clear fake. And the New York Times is the blind thing being led by the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Look, there is increasing anti-Semitism. I've mentioned True News, which I think has just completely gone off the charts on anti-Semitism. They deny it. It's shocking to me, the things that I hear coming from that organization these days. But the truth is the truth. What they say, there was a show this week that I listened to a bit of, and it was as bad as anything I've ever heard coming from someone who claims to be a Christian. Luther would be proud. Well, let's just focus a little bit on the situation. Now, we know that there's this potential peace deal. I played a clip of Jared Kushner. He's been running around. He's given speeches in Los Angeles and D.C. and New York, and he's really not given any details of this so-called peace plan. I was asked a question about this the other night at DeVore, and I'll give you my comments in just a moment. The first thing we see, though, is that the Palestinians are in a pretty difficult situation. The other day, they had a Palestinian Central Committee meeting in Ramallah, and Abbas gave a speech. And one of the things that they've had trouble with is they're on the verge of financial collapse. A lot of countries have withdrawn support from the Palestinians over the past year, in part because of the pressure put on them by the Trump administration. Various UN agencies have had their funding pulled by the United States and some other countries, a lot of which went to the Palestinians. Abbas has approached Russia to see if they thought the EU would step in. Abbas and the Palestinians thought that the EU would step in to replace these payments. The EU has not seemed to step in and increase their contributions to the Palestinians. Thus, Abbas has now turned to Russia and Putin and asked Putin to make up the differences. Now, the funding of the Palestinians seems to be tied into what's going on with regard to this upcoming peace plan. Now, the question in everybody's mind is this peace plan the Daniel 9:27 covenant that will be confirmed with the many? I was asked a question about this the other night at DeVore, and my answer was, I don't know if it got onto the video or not at the end, but my response was that I really don't know if it is or not. I think that it would be a good thing for everybody to, rather than running around pronouncing that this is the covenant, to talk about what we think based on Scripture, what the covenant actually is. For a long time now, everybody just sort of assumed that it will be a peace agreement. But I'm not convinced from the Scripture that that's what's going to be the covenant. And I'm willing to be educated on the matter. I'm just saying, as I've studied it a lot, and I think we're a little bit too quick to pronounce that this is that. This is that which was prophesied. I think we need to look at this and talk about this in a little bit more detail. Now, there are some reports that are coming out about what is part of this Trump plan. One report came from Al Akbar. This is a report on it in the Jerusalem Post this week. Saudi Arabia offered Abbas $10 billion to accept Trump's peace plan. Now, I don't know, I can't say that this is for certain. I did spend a considerable amount of time this week going through Al Akbar's tweets on the subject, through their newspaper, running their Arabic language through Google Translate, to see at least what was reported. So what I'm going to share to you now is what Al Akbar, this is a Lebanese Arab newspaper, is reporting about this peace deal. The cover here says, Amman and Ramallah in the face of Saudi treachery. It has bullet points. You can see them right here, the bullet points. $10 billion in an embassy in Abu Dis. Abu Dis is East Jerusalem. That's what the Palestinians claim should be their capital. Jerusalem figures reject Saudi guardianship. What apparently is going to be proposed in this Trump plan, and again, there's no way to verify this. We'll know in 3 or 4 weeks. If it's released in 3 or 4 weeks, there always seems to be a reason for delay, that Saudi Arabia would be given guardianship over the holy sites, the Islamic holy sites in Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, which would include the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the other mosques that have been constructed, a couple of which are underground. Jordan is not happy about this. Jordan used to be the Hashemite family, of which the current king is a descendant. They claim to be direct descendants of Muhammad. Used to be known as the Sheriff of Mecca and Medina. In other words, they controlled the holy sites, the holiest sites of Islam in Mecca and Medina. They were pushed out of power by the Saudis. The British brought them gave them control over the holy sites in Jerusalem. So there's a lot of speculation. Are the Saudis being pushed to the front by this Trump plan? We do not know. We do not know whether this is true yet or not. Here again is some of the reports from Al-Akhbar, the Arab newspaper that I've been citing. Ibn Salman is tempting Abu Mazen. Ibn Salman is King Salman of Saudi Arabia. Ibn Salman is Mohammed bin Salman, which means Mohammed, son of Salman, who is the king. This is the crown prince. Is tempting Abu Mazen. Abu Mazen is the Arabic name for Mahmoud Abbas. $10 billion and an embassy in Abu Dis. The reports, this is what the article says, reports from the Jordanian embassy in Ramallah to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Immigrants in Amman show the extent of Jordan's concern, which could affect the kingdom from the consequences of the deal of the century, which the U.S. president intends to disclose in June. The Jordanian concern is understandable, especially after the American and British media reveal the heavy tax to be paid by the Kingdom of Jordan regarding the possibility. Regarding these, the possibility of settling the Palestinians on its territory, the withdrawal of the Hashemite guardianship from the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the holy sites in Jerusalem and granting them to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and the possibility of deducting land from its eastern borders, parts of northern Saudi Arabia, and sort of a land swap. This is at least what's been reporting. And again, I mentioned this earlier. In 1924, the Palestinians, Sharif Hussein bin Ali, pledged allegiance to them and gave them the right to the guardianship of holy sites in occupied Palestine, because they were kicked out of Saudi Arabia, the Hashemites. Since that date, the Kingdom of Jordan has managed the affairs of the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem and has considered itself a guardian of the holy sites and linked the Council of Aqfa in the city with his Jordanian counterpart. This is a little awkward language because it's a translation. This is what the godfathers of the deal of the century are trying to change within the new map for the region, which President Donald Trump plans to announce in June. So we'll just have to wait a few weeks to see whether this comes true. Now, Jared Kushner spoke at the Washington Institute for the Near East Studies in Washington this week, and this is just a brief clip of what he had to say about the peace plan.
It's an unfortunate situation, but they've been pawns in a greater game in the Middle East for a long time. I mean, you have a lot of Palestinians that were kicked out of Arab countries for whatever reason and put into the situation they're in. Arab countries who claim to fight for them and care about them wouldn't take them into their countries when they were refugees. So you've got a very twisted history there, and I think that you've got a current situation where you've got Hamas, obviously in Gaza, which is just driven that place into the ground, and it's really, I think the people are hostages to a terror organization, and that's an unfortunate situation. And then in the West Bank, I think you have people who are pretty repressed And again, I think that they question whether the leadership is actually looking after their interests or not. And so, again, I think that for the Palestinians, the political aspirations are important. I do believe what we'll put out will address a lot of their political aspirations and a lot of their dignity. That is important to us. But I just think that they're at a point where they're not able to live the lives that they think they deserve because a lot of this has kind of screwed it up for them. And
Is the plan going to be a surprise to Prime Minister Netanyahu, to the leaders of Jordan and Syria and Egypt, not Syria, Saudi Arabia and Egypt? Are they going to be reading about it the same day we all read about it, or are they going to be briefed ahead of time, and will you welcome their input at all before the final version is delivered?
Yeah, so again, to date we've kept the details very close, and the way that we've kept it very close is that nothing's leaked out, and I think that's been a great asset.
And that's what Jared Kushner had to say. Well, the last thing to talk about, of course, is the massive barrage of rocket attacks into Israel that have taken place over the last 24 hours. My Red Alert app has been going off almost constantly since yesterday afternoon here in California. Some probably over 800 rockets now. Several Israeli citizens have been killed. Israel has responded with attacks. You hear some of the statistics. I mean, this was this morning or last evening at 10:06. There were 430 had been fired, and I think almost a similar number have been fired since that time. Israel's responded with some targeted killings, the first since 2014. One of the people was Hamad Ahmed Kadari's car was attacked in Gaza today. He was one of the terrorists that did these attacks. This is actually a video of the actual from the IDF, Israeli Defense Force, on the attack on Hamed Kadari's car this morning in the Gaza Strip. He, of course, was killed. And as they would say, don't be like Hamad Ahmed Kadari. Another place that was destroyed was the headquarters of Hamas in Gaza. Now, it's interesting. There is this, this is from Sky News in the UK. Pregnant Palestinian woman and baby killed in Gaza violence. That's what they chose. They didn't mention 850 rockets. And so this is the usual progression. We only talk about Israel's response. We don't talk about what prompted Israel to respond. This is this is just another thing where it shows that the world is completely divided on things. Here's a picture of Hamas headquarters, and this is from the IDF, either the IDF or the Mossad Twitter account. Here is another building that was destroyed in Gaza, and you can see Israel did a very direct, targeted strike. I'm not aware of a lot of casualties that took place in the Gaza Strip from these attacks. There was a man killed by some shrapnel that came through a window in Ashkelon yesterday. His house was hit by a rocket. He died. And this is what one of the Twitter pages says. His funeral was this morning, and they asked that no pictures be taken of his body or anything at the funeral. 82-year-old mother has to bury her 58-year-old son. 13 siblings have to bury their brother. 4 children have to bury their father. A wife has to bury her husband. Rocket fire from the Gaza Strip killed Moshe Agadi of Ashkelon. We mourn, we cry, and we grow even stronger. To give you an example of what it's like during a terror attack, I found this on a Twitter feed this morning. I think it may have been linked by Brian Schrager of the Heim Report, which you can link to get a lot of updates. Brian's been doing a lot of work on his Facebook page and his Twitter account, keeping people apprised of what's going on. Listen, the attacks here probably have Iran at the heart of them. Iran is trying, and I think that part of the thing that's being done here is a test case for what will happen when Iran wants to attack with Hezbollah from the north. They are testing the Israeli defense systems. I believe that 100 of the rockets were intercepted. When a rocket is launched, now I'm not a military expert, but my understanding is this is what happens. They immediately make a calculation of where that rocket is going to land, and they know, because they have detailed maps of the area where the rocket will land, if it's going to hit anything. But you will see the red alerts come off, and immediately as the rockets are fired, they're able to calculate trajectory and where that rocket should land. So they don't have to shoot down every one if it's going to land in an open space. They did intercept over at least 100 of the rockets that were fired. The others, of course, they didn't think were going to damage people or persons, so they let them go, because it's very expensive to fire the rockets that serve as a defense shield. It's not cheap to do that. So, but I think what they're trying to do is they're testing to see how the Israelis respond defensively to a barrage of rocket attacks, because we know that for whatever rockets, and it's interesting that, you know, Gaza's been under this blockade for many years now, and they have these, you know, this is not the first time this has happened. In the last month, they've had this barrage of rockets. How are they getting these rockets through the blockade into Gaza? And it's clear that, I think it's pretty clear that they have Iranian assistance in doing that. But whatever number of rockets that Hamas and Gaza has, you can multiply that by about 100 to find out the number of rockets that could be launched by Hezbollah. And Hezbollah has multiple rocket launchers. They have missiles that have longer ranges, things that can be guided a little bit better, but Israel's been trying to keep them from developing the guidance systems and manufacturing them in Syria. But this is, I think this clearly has the hands of Iran all over. But to give you an example, this is what an Israeli family went through when the sirens started sounding today and they needed to get in the car and go someplace else. And this is pretty loud. It's about a minute long. I'm going to play it at the volume that it was. Well, that gives you an idea of what people in southern Israel and even up into central Israel now go through when these rockets start being launched. They have roughly 15 to 30 to maybe 45 seconds to get to a bomb shelter. Even if they stay in their house, they're not safe because, as in the case of the gentleman who was killed in Ashkelon, the shrapnel came through a window. It would be great to see peace between these people. We know that that won't happen until the Prince of Peace comes. Well, I'm going to conclude this week's prophecy update there. I will be back at FBC next Sunday to do an update. And then the following Sunday, I'm going to be down in Florida. I believe I'm going to be at Superior Word to help out with a prophecy update there on Sunday, May 19th in Sarasota, Florida. So that'll be it for now. And again, if you want to see my teaching on Ezekiel chapter 23, kind of an updated teaching on that, you can go to Devore Truth YouTube channel. Thanks for listening.